could track aircraft in the sky. The pace of progress was accelerating and air forces around the world struggled to counter each new improvement. In the first months of the Second Indochina War, commonly known as the Vietnam War, American aircraft began to suffer losses from North Vietnamese SAMs, which were supplied by the Soviet Union. The SAMs covered medium to high altitudes, up to 60,000 feet in the case of the SA-2. When U.S. aircraft came in at low altitude to avoid the missiles, they were vulnerable to traditional anti-aircraft fire. To counter this threat, the U.S. Air Force initiated a program called Wild Weasel. The program became so successful that the name has since been applied to every U.S. Air Force aircraft developed for this sort of mission. The mission of a Wild Weasel aircraft is to locate enemy anti-aircraft radar and either destroy it or target it for attack by other aircraft, usually accompanying ground attack planes. Radar systems send out waves of energy that reflect off targets, such as aircraft, and return to the radar device, allowing radar operators to track and target the aircraft. But these waves can themselves be detected and tracked back to their source, revealing the position of the radar and allowing the hunted to become the hunters. Accomplishing this task requires specialized equipment and weapons not carried by regular aircraft. The U.S. Air Force began the Wild Weasel program in October 1965, just a few months after the North Vietnamese SAMs, crewed largely by Soviet advisors, began taking their toll of American planes. By early November the basic equipment had been tested and field testing began. Electronic warfare officers, AWOS, learned how to operate the electronics and read the displays that would lead them to enemy radar. Those radars not only had to turn on to lock onto a target, but also had to stay on long enough to track it and then home in on it. The test missions were flown against American radar systems that were similar to the Fan Song. AWOS learned that their equipment worked best at medium altitudes flying directly toward the radar beam's point of origin. Results were poor when flying at low altitude or parallel to the source. The Wild Weasel proved able to detect the Fan Song radar signals beyond the 17-mile range of the SA-2, but it had to get closer to pinpoint the exact location. Once the signal was detected, a device called a panoramic scan receiver gave an initial direction the plane could follow to close the range. As the distance grew shorter, the signal grew stronger. The shorter range vector homing and ranging set could then start detecting it. The AWO could compare readings to ensure they were on the proper heading and roughly gauge the distance. With that determination made, the crew could search visually for the SAM position. The field testing ended on November 18 and the crews were sent to Southeast Asia for operational testing. There, they would have 3 months to figure out how to best take the fight to the SAMs. The new Wild Weasel F-100F aircraft arrived at Korat, Thailand, along with their crews, mechanics, and support personnel on November 24. They soon began flying missions over North Vietnam. By late December, Donovan and Lamb had knocked out their first SAM site, and the program was on its way to becoming a staple of the U.S. Air Force in Vietnam. The U.S. Air Force dubbed the initial missions Iron Hand. The missions were made up of 1 F-100F and 3 or 4 F-105D Thunder Chief fighter bombers, affectionately known as Thuds. The Thuds were faster than the older F-100s and therefore had to fly in a weaving formation to avoid passing the slower lead aircraft. The evaluation period ended in January 1966. While the concept was sound, it was recognized that the F-100F was too obsolete to perform effectively. To replace it, the Air Force tested the two-seat F-105F as a Wild Weasel and the first 5 planes arrived in Korat in May 1966. Another half-dozen aircraft arrived a month later. While the Air Force was steadily improving its aircraft, the U.S. Navy designed a new weapon to make the risky job of destroying SAM sites easier. The AGM-45 Shrike was a modification of the Sparrow air-to-air missile designed specifically to home on radar. It was the first of a series of anti-radiation missiles that would allow the Wild Weasels to engage the SAMs with more than just unguided rockets. It carried a 149-pound warhead that could easily destroy radar units such as the Fan Song. To target a particular radar, the Wild Weasel pilot had to fly directly at it until he was close enough for the homing system to work. The initial versions of the Shrike could not do that until they were within range of the SA-2. Since the Shrike's rocket motor burned out after 10 seconds, this meant that the missile continued its flight unguided. Still, as long as the missile was aimed accurately, it would still detonate within 20 feet of the radar. As a countermeasure, the radar operators would turn their system off, which often threw the missile off track. This was not a complete loss, though, as a switched-off radar was useless for guiding SA-2s. The first U.S. Air Force use of the Shrike missile occurred on April 18, 1966, when a Wild Weasel used one to target a Sun-9 radar that was used to direct the fire of 57mm and 100mm anti-aircraft guns. The missile disappeared into some haze before striking the target, but the A-1 noted the radar stopped functioning, indicating it had been damaged. Nevertheless, Wild Weasels remained vulnerable to gunfire and enemy fighters. By August 1966, only 4 of the 11 F-105FS in Thailand were still operable. Other fighter wings operating the F-105FS had lost 5 aircraft, with 2 other damaged beyond repair. In October, a half-dozen replacements arrived and were split between the various units to allow them all to operate. As missions continued, the limitations of the Shrike were noted by the aircrews. The North Vietnamese radar operators realized the Wild Weasel aircraft had to fly straight at their target, so they would turn off their radars whenever they saw a plane coming directly toward them. They also recognized that Wild Weasel hunter-killer teams operated in groups of 4 or 5 aircraft. Since this was smaller than the normal strike missions, they would simply shut down while the Americans were nearby. In addition, they started operating their radars for shorter periods. The U.S. Air Force aviators noticed the North Vietnamese counters and developed new tactics of their own. They would fly threateningly toward enemy SAM sites just to get them to shut down. Sometimes they would bomb suspected radar sites just to keep their opponents off balance while strike missions were in the area. If a radar crew was bold enough to start transmitting, the Wild Weasels would quickly and aggressively attack it. They would also fly close to the strike missions to avoid standing out, so the enemy would switch on their radars long enough to be targeted. Over time, simply suppressing the radars became more of a priority than actually destroying them. One of the most famous Wild Weasel mission of the war took place on March 10, 1967, against the Tai Nguyen Steel Works 40 miles north of Hanoi. This factory complex was protected by an extensive radar-controlled anti-aircraft network. F-105 pilot Captain Merlin Detlefsen took off carrying a load of bombs in addition to a pair of Shrike missiles. The young pilot wondered how much damage the Shrike could do by itself and hoped that by attacking with heavier weapons he might inflict substantial damage. Detlefsen was flying with another F-105 Wild Weasel and a pair of F-105D bombers. Together they made up a standard Iron Hand flight. They flew 30 to 45 miles ahead of the main strike force, which equated to about 5 to 7 minutes of flying time. Once over the target, the aircraft would have to stay in the area, otherwise the enemy radar operators would just wait until they were gone and switch their sets back on when the strike force arrived. The factory was defended by both SAMs and traditional anti-aircraft guns. As Detlefsen and the other flyers of the Iron Hand force approached the target, they encountered heavy fire from the ground. It was so dense he soon lost sight of the other aircraft in his flight. The smoke from bursting shells was so thick it obscured them. "The sky was just black," said Detlefsen. "You know you're not bulletproof when explosions are rocking your wings and you can hear metal hitting metal." Captain Kevin Gilroy, his A-1, soon located a Fan Song radar despite the deluge of steel they were enduring. The pilot quickly launched a Shrike at it, but just as he did so, a pair of MiG-21 interceptors attacked them from behind. One MiG-21 launched a heat-seeking missile at the F-105 and Detlefsen dove to avoid it, flying straight through the layer of flak from the enemy anti-aircraft guns. Despite the danger, Detlefsen stayed overhead until his fuel finally ran low. Gilroy detected another Fan Song and Detlefsen used his other missile to attack it. Destroyed or not, it went quiet. Minutes later, the pilot saw a radar van sitting amid another SA-2 missile site. Diving on it, he strafed the van with his 20mm cannon and blanketed the area with bombs. When they returned to base, they expected some recognition for their actions, but some fighter pilots had shot down some MiGs and all the celebration was focused on them. Their skilled flying did not go unremembered, though. In early 1968, Detlefsen was awarded the Medal of Honor and Gilroy received an Air Force Cross for their accomplishments over Tai Nguyen. Both would complete more than 100 missions over Vietnam. Based on experiences such as those at Tai Nguyen, the U.S. Air Force began changing its tactics. It tightened the flying formations. Now the strike force flew 1 minute behind the leading Iron Hand flight. A second Iron Hand group followed just behind or beside the strike force to deal with other enemy radar-guided weapons. 2 flights could cover more area and continue covering the strike force throughout its attack and subsequent withdrawal. 1 flight could also serve as a decoy, tricking the radar crew into switching on after the first Iron Hand flight passed. In March 1968, the U.S. Air Force also introduced the AGM-78 Standard Anti-Radiation Missile, which boasted a 219-pound warhead. It also had an improved guidance system that would allow the missile to continue tracking even if the radar was switched off after launch. The standard anti-radiation missile could turn up to 180 degrees after firing.